All right, good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so excited to be here with all of you in person and virtually to celebrate this beautiful book, South to South, Writing South Asia in the American South. Those of you who know me maybe know that I was a Southern literature major, so I'm always excited when we get to talk about Southern literature. And I'm so excited to have so many up and coming and also established writers here with us tonight. I am going to introduce Anar Parikh as our moderator tonight, and Anar is going to introduce everyone else and kind of lead us through the program. First, I want to thank Raksha. So Raksha was like, "Hey, I want to always co-host stuff. Why didn't you ask immediately?" And obviously we should have. So for folks who don't know, Raksha is an amazing partner organization that Charis does work with all the time. They serve South Asian communities and make sure that people in all of our communities have access to safe spaces in lots of different ways. So thank you to Aparna, to Raksha, for always supporting our work. We hope to always support yours. So Anar is a South Asian American scholars practitioner whose social justice commitments were bred in youth organizing spaces in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is her hometown. She's invested in abolitionist and radical Black and Indigenous feminist approaches to liberation and social justice. She has a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from Brown University, and she's going to be leading us through this evening's event. So I want to let folks know that they can ask questions in the chat if they're watching virtually. And for y'all who are physically in the room, if you would like to ask questions when the time comes, I'll bring you a microphone so that you may be heard by everyone here. So without further ado, thank you so much for being with us. Put your hands together to celebrate South to South.
Sorry, I'm just gonna figure out how to position this. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this discussion. I think I remember. Everyone hear me? You're good. I think I remember seeing the CFP for this volume circulating a few years back and aspirationally wanting to be a part of it. So, and Rukmini is a good friend, and I have a fellowship here in Atlanta, and Anjali is one of my mentors for that fellowship. So this is a really nice way to be a part of this conversation. Like all of the contributors to this volume, to this anthology, I have been deeply shaped in and by the U.S. South. I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina. That is the only place that my parents have lived since they moved to the United States in the 1980s. And my aunts are spread out across North Carolina and Georgia with little stints in Mississippi. So each of the locations in this anthology, I recognized small parts of my own sort of experience. And Charlotte is where, as a teenager, I got my foundational political education, and that in a way that shaped my academic and political pursuits in the future, even after I left the South for over a decade. So, while, as Khem notes in the intro to South, there's no single or definitive South Asian American experience, one point of commonality I see often is the desire to see ourselves and our experiences rendered. But representation is tricky because it doesn't guarantee recognition or belonging. For me, more often than not, whatever initial excitement I have about seeing a version of myself in culture sort of quickly evaporates because as specificity so frequently gets reduced into tropes, archetypes, and caricatures. This volume, I think, is really special because it navigates that problem. It was clear to me as I read that the contributions were not only deeply personal, but this project was a real opportunity to be specific and vulnerable. So, with that, I think we can sort of like take the kind of notion of specificity and vulnerability into this conversation. I have a couple of directed questions for each of the contributors, and then one for the whole group. So I think to start off, I'd love for Khem, as the editor, to just tell us a little bit about how this volume came to be.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here tonight. So wonderful to see such a big group here to talk about South to South, a project that I was not very sure that I could actually complete when it started, but finally we are here. I'm so glad to be with all the contributors and everybody. And actually, special thanks to the organizers, all of you here. And Anjali, you did so much work to make this happen. And Anar, of course, and right, everyone. Before the formal program started, we were talking about that. I mean, I would love to talk about how it started. That's the easiest thing to do. It's all about it's about that process, but at the same time, I kind of find it a little hard because a lot of times personal and social other things conflate. Then where do you make that distinction, and then see how do you actually see it as something that's not just you, of course, right? It's not possible, but still, I'll start with a very personal story. And that's how it started. I was teaching at Syracuse University until 2017, and I moved to Arkansas because I got a tenure track job there. What that means for me was, okay, now I'm here with this job. That means maybe I'm going to stay here a little longer. So that also means as a writer, then I had to know the place, of course. Then I had to know the conversation, basically. Of course, we'd been reading literature. I'd been reading literature even back in Nepal. I'm from Nepal. Maybe most of you know that by now. The literature from the South, the classic, that was one thing. But being here and then being a writer, and then what does it mean to me? So I was curious, basically. I'm here now as a writer. Who am I going to interact with? I mean, what's the conversation I'm going to join? Basically, that was the idea. And as I was thinking about this, then, overall literature written in the South, that's one thing. But I wanted to be more specific, like, okay, as a South Asian writer, let's say somebody who wanted to be a writer, let's say. So, I mean, who are those people that I need to join? What's the conversation going on? I could see here and there, but I didn't know them. I had seen some writing, I read something, but I didn't know any of them. But I had this friend, actually he was in India, right, those years, and he moved to Georgia. We were in constant contact. And then I had that idea around 2019. Oh yeah, this whole idea of South Asian experience in the American South. But again, the idea was, this is the South. We call this the South. Then what does actually it mean? See, what does it mean to call something the South? And the South, the idea of the American South, it may not be the South for us because, again, the American South is basically defined by the American North. Traditionally, if we go back, that's how it goes. But for us now, 2000, let's say 1920, maybe that's not the case. So we South Asian people come here and then live here. Then what does it mean for us? I was curious about that also. Then in 2019, I'm not taking too long. I'll try to shorten it. In 2019, I wrote a proposal for AWP that was going to be held in San Antonio, Texas. So it was going to be in the South. We are living in the South. South Asian writers. Maybe they'll accept that proposal. That was the idea. And we discussed. I called Aruni first. He was my go-to person, wonderful writer. Even then, it's been many years. Of course, he has produced so much after that. And yeah, he said, yeah, that's a great idea. Then through him, I came in contact with other people. Then I proposed that panel in which there was Sonia. I'm sorry, she's not able to be here tonight because of some dental issues, right? So Sonia, and then Parul, a wonderful writer based here in Atlanta, right?
She was born in Assam.
Oh, she was born in Assam. I had no idea about that. And Parul, and who else? We three, and
There was Padma. Padma Vishwanath.
oh yeah, right, huh?
From
Yeah, yeah, she was also there. Then anyway, so what happened was into 2020. Then because of coronavirus, Aruni could not make it. Padma could not make it. Parul could not make it. So there were only two basically. Me and Sonia, and also I think
Shantani.
right. Anyway, so it was a small group there to present. But what was really interesting and what was very encouraging was the attendance was really good. So many people came over, and then see, once we share our ideas, read our work, and they wanted to share their own work, and actually they shared. It was so nice. So that was very encouraging. Then I went back, and then after some time, I had that idea. Yeah, there is so much interest in it. Not just interest. Then, of course, by now I was also knowing more and more writers. I was also reading more and more work. I did more research, and then I saw that there is something that we can or should do. Not just can, but should. That's where actually it went beyond the personal. That's what I was kind of trying to hint at right at the beginning. So this is something that we should do. There is such a huge, actually, in terms of the population as well, the South Asian South Asians coming to the South and settling here is growing, and people are writing and sharing. So we should do something. Again, we discussed the people on the panel, Aruni, Sonia, and all of us, and I put out a call for the anthology. And that's how basically it started. I think maybe you are interested in how I selected some work, or what my idea was, or even the publication process. Maybe I'll do that when we have with questions and all that.
Some more time at the end, and then if that comes up in the question answers. Yep. You did remind me that I missed a crucial part of any good book event, which is introducing the writers. So we'll just pretend that this is a perfectly usual time that we do that. So today we have Khem Aryal, a writer, editor, and teacher of writing. Anjali Enjeti, an Atlanta-based former attorney, journalist, and Kalamangalam, an Indian American poet from Houston, and Aruni Kashyap, who writes in Assamese and English. Soniah Kamal couldn't be with us today, but is also, here in spirit. So just to give you a little bit of context about who's here today. So with that, let's start with some conversation about the pieces that are in the collection. Aruni, as I was reading Nafisa Ali's Life, Love, and Friendships before and after the travel ban, I was focused on the everydayness of Nafisa's movements. She goes to the lab, she comes home, she interacts with her neighbors. But the story then subtly shifts in the immediate aftermath of the Muslim travel ban. I'd love for you to talk about how the personal is shaped by the political, not just in some abstract way, but how the political might prompt us to rethink who we are and how we move through the world.
Thank you for a great question. I'll talk briefly about the story. When I moved to Georgia, I really did not know that I would move to Georgia. I knew nothing about Georgia except for what I had watched in Hollywood movies or the novels. And actually, the best depiction of Georgia I was familiar with was through Thierry Jones's Leaving Atlanta, because she had come to my grad school when I was a grad student, and I bought the book. And so thank you, Thierry Jones. But when I moved in 2018, the 45th was doing all of these things. And then I could see that the people who were actually least bothered about politics became very, very bothered because it really, really infringed on their lives. So Nafisa Ali's life from Assam, surviving an insurgency against Indian rule, to come here to political instability was something very, very appealing to me. But also she was a very weird character. She has never done anything really exciting in her life. She has probably never even said the word fuck in her life. She has been a very loyal person, extremely monogamous, and everything is unlike me. And but I thought, because I have written so many characters who are so much like me, I should focus on somebody from Assam who is not like me. So that's the reason I wrote. And then what really found as I was writing it, what really I found interesting was that she grew so much in my head, and the ending I thought initially didn't really happen. But what really was that she took me to these really, really interesting corners of her life, and where she comes across as a very somewhat subversive, but not so subversive, because she's so deeply affected by the politics that really even also affects the relationship with her husband, who is taking care of her mother-in-law in India, and he's not able to come because of the visa ban and the travel ban and all of that. And she does something surprising eventually at the end, and totally out of character because of all the stress put together. But having said that, I grew up in Assam, and since 1979, Assam is a state in northeastern part of India. Assam has been waging insurgency, an armed, bloody insurgency against Indian rule. So most of my life in the 80s and 90s in Assam were about talking about bomb blasts and military gun battles with insurgents in the breakfast table. Most of the time, I would go out home, and we would know that we could not even come back that day because anything might happen. And in fact, there's a very interesting thing that used to happen was my mother used to always insist that she looked at my face at least once before I stepped out of the house and got into the school bus. When I grew up later, I asked, why would she do that? Because she said, because you may not come back home that day. So I wanted you to have a last image of you every day when you went out. So growing up like that, what actually meant for me when I moved to Delhi, I realized that the headlines were very different about the rise of onion prices, or how short was Sania Mirza, the teddy bear skirt, and how there was a fatwa against it. This is 2004, 2005. So those were electricity prices. That were the headlines in the front page news in Delhi, in Hindustan Times and Times of India. But the editions of English editions or the Assamese editions that we had back in Assam was never like that. It was always about how many people had died and what is the oppression and what new thing the security forces have done. So for me, actually, to write something that is devoid of the political was nearly impossible, because that's how I have grown up. That even if I was not interested in the political aspect of the society, we were constantly drawn into the vortex of that, like many of the protagonists of Nadine Gordimer's fiction, probably, especially A World of Strangers, her first novel, where people who are not necessarily always interested, but they are drawn into the politics. But I think that's what politics is. Even if you say that I'm an apolitical person, I'm not interested, but actually you are affected and shaped by politics. And there is no other option for us but to actually participate in it to make the world a better. And as a storyteller, I was trying to understand what it meant to live post 2016 as an immigrant who has this very set out trajectory like Nafisa, But at the same time, this story doesn't explore, but we must also remember that we really talk about the citizenship inequality as well. For example, it is so easy for someone from Britain or European country to get a green card, but for Indians and Chinese and Mexicans and Filipino people, it's more than 12 years, 10 years for majority of the time. And I was constantly in this group because I was applying for my green card then. And I used to hear these really, really horrible stories of people waiting forever for their permanent residency, people getting sick and dying and had to go back home, separating from their families. So there was another kind of bloodbath that was happening. So post 2016, these things became so much more vexed and so much more vicious. And I think people of color definitely face the most, but at the same time, the immigrants, because especially from these countries that I mentioned, they suffered even more because their whole residency application, everything was delayed endlessly and thrown into an abyss. So even though the story doesn't mention it, but story is also trying to tap into that conversation, because that was the most biggest conversation in the South Asian media, especially Indian media, because there are almost 2 million people waiting for 10 years or 12 years for a green card, and we rarely talk about it, actually.
Thank you. Hearing you talk, I just really appreciated the opportunity to hear from you about the story and what getting to hear from the author can do, because I agree that when I was reading, I was like, this character is so strange. And I mean, I don't, strange just in terms of, I felt maybe a little stilted. And I loved hearing how you were thinking about that character sort of in relation to yourself or trying to inhabit somebody else, and also imagining what somebody's life might be like when they do have such a routine. So thank you.
Yeah, she's a good girl, good daughter. She cleaned her room, made her bed, always came first.
I think it's a perfect segue also to talking about Anjali's essay, which is about the afterlife of trauma, and specifically how scary it is to be in small Southern towns as a person of color, and how that fear lingers even when we're safe, or when we're with people who make us feel safe. Your documentation of that fear of small towns in Drinking Giant Savannah really struck me, because even as you capture the potency of that lingering fear, I also know that you are extremely sort of politically active and committed to being politically active in Georgia, in the South. And so I'd love to hear from you, what is the intersection for you between your literary writing about living in the South and your political work?
I love that question. Thank you so much, Anar, for asking it. First of all, I just want to say, I was thinking about this on the drive down, and then I will answer your question. I moved to the South. I moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee when I was 10 years old from a suburb of Detroit, Michigan. And so I am not a South Asian that a lot of generations that came since the Immigration and Naturalization Act was passed in 1965, in that I never, I did not really grow up in an area with a lot of South Asians. There was a community, but the community was very small. I'm 50 years old. I came of age in the 70s, 80s, and graduated from high school in 1991. So I say this to simply say that I could not have imagined in my teens or even 20s a panel with South Asians from the South. This book is beyond my wildest dreams. Now, I have contemporaries who grew up in New York City and New Jersey, who grew up in, San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago and Houston, who had a very different experience of growing up South Asian. But to be a South Asian Southerner, starting 20 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed, in a small city, was a really different experience than, say, a 50-year-old South Asian growing up in a major metropolitan area. I was a South Asian who did not know anyone did not personally know another South Asian writer until I joined Facebook in 2006. I did not. Now, I read a lot of South Asian literature, right? I would attend an event, but I did not have any friends who were South Asian writers. I also did not have any friends who were South Asian activists, which is the other part of my life. I did things in buckets. It's like be around South Asians, be around writers, none of whom are South Asian, be around activists, none of whom are South Asian. So I wasn't even able to meld these very important parts of my identity until I was in my late 20s, early 30s. Just to give you all a perspective of how things have changed and how social media has connected a lot of the smaller communities in the United States, because this I could not have imagined. So growing up in the South, really, my essay is about sort of a racialized incident that happened when I was 17. This was during the Iraq War. A lot of what is happening to a lot of people today. The xenophobia was really bad. The racism was really bad. But what I could not figure out how to do is to be in spaces that could alleviate that incidence and other incidents of racialized trauma in the South with my own people, right? So what I would eventually come to learn is that I could be in activism spaces with other South Asians, many of whom were writers, right? And so that was a journey for me, for being, I knew that a great way to deal with this trauma was to get involved in justice work, right? It's very therapeutic. It's very hard. It's very, draining, but it is also extremely therapeutic. But I would be in activist spaces for 15 years before there was another South Asian face that I was connecting with all the organizations I was working with. But that has always been the road for me, was deal with the trauma, but then what do I do with it? Like, you can't really package it and put it away. You kind of just carry it with you, and you are oftentimes triggered by it. So that's what got me involved in social change work. And I worked in a lot of different spaces for a long time, mostly white spaces. There were some people of color. These were organizations that were just not friendly to Black and Brown people. So many Black and Brown people did not last because there was no leadership with BIPOC people or just folks who knew how to be inclusive. But I've been very, very lucky that, with the internet and with social media, I have been able to I've been working now primarily in Asian American spaces as an activist, particularly a South Asian activist space. And now I have like a community of writers. So it was a very natural thing for me, to use the writing and use the activism to sort of work through a lot of the trauma and find a community that worked through trauma in similar ways. But it wasn't until my early 30s, really, before I could actually be all of me in one place, and I could find my people. And oh my gosh, we are a large group of people, right? But I didn't know we existed. It was so weird. I didn't know I could be the activist, writer, and South Asian at the same time until I was well into adulthood. So I just want to give my thanks to Khem for coming up with this idea, Khem and Sonia, and whoever else was at the AWP conference, because this is something that a lot of people like me who grew up in the U.S. in areas where we did not have a lot of our people, could never have pictured South Asians, Southern South Asians, talking about these things. So thank you. I have no idea if I answered that question. I was just getting very emotional.
It's a great answer. Thank you. And, to what you say, it's so interesting where you position yourself, because I remember one of the first conversations Rukmini and I had. Rukmini shared with me that she has no intention of leaving the South. You know, she grew up in Texas and lives in Georgia now, but has always known that she will live in the South. And I am probably somewhere in between Rukmini and Anjali. And for me, you know, I think there were some inklings of that, but I always knew and thought that I would leave the South to go to college, to go to graduate school, all of that. And when I moved to Atlanta last year in September, that was the first time that I have like fully lived in the South, sort of like even in public life in almost 15 years. And, you know, it is, I can also feel myself getting emotional, you know, like I think that is a really emotional thing to be able to see how that has like really shifted over the course of the past 3 or 4 decades. So with that, Rukmini, I really loved your essay, Slow Fruiting, and I learned today that Rukmini's was the only essay that was accepted out of the open call for submission. So that's pretty amazing. You know, you really take us to so many places and points of time using these various pieces of fruit. So I think this piece really captures the embodiment of personal and familial histories through what we eat and where we eat it. And I'd love for you to read from your piece.
Absolutely. Would you mind sliding that
Yeah.
mic over here?
Yeah, that way you
I
can
would
hold the
be
book
able
open.
to read.
Oh, nice.
Okay, here we go. Teamwork.
Yes.
Dreamwork.
Hold on, I'll bring it closer to you.
Thank you. All right. I'm so sorry, y'all. Technical difficulties. I grew up doing slam poetry, and we would say like mic choreo before, you know, we got to get the mic ready before you talk. Unfortunately, this is not choreographed beautifully, but we're here together, and that's what matters. Okay. Okay. Can y'all hear me? Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. Today was also my first day finding out that somehow I got lucky and got let into this thing. So I'm just overjoyed to get to be here with, you know, people that I've been following on Twitter and reading their works, you know, people who taught me how to be South Asian in the South. So this is awesome. I think Anar like really hit on it when she was talking about my piece. It's about fruit, because of course it is, because we as the diaspora can't go anywhere without talking about gardens. And I think that a big part of being South Asian and being in the South has been that like just pure luck that we get to grow the things that grow in our homeland, right? So like I get to grow the curry leaf plants and the lemongrass and you know, all those beautiful things. And so the essay that I wrote charts a few different places in spaces in time via fruit. And so I want to locate us for right now in Louisiana. In the beginning of the pandemic, I was living with my father in Florida, and I was extremely depressed. And so I ran away to live with my aunt in northeastern Louisiana. It was my first time living in a more rural southern place. Growing up in Houston, you know, I had the exact opposite of Anjali's experience. I grew up with South Asians and all types of other immigrant folks all around me. So there I was in northeastern Louisiana, and with my aunt, my grandaunt, and uncle, I experienced northeastern Louisiana's very first hurricane. And that is when I knew that I was in the South, for real, for real. Like the Gulf has expanded to include other places that are not the Gulf. And I said, I know how to do this. I know how to be Southern here, because I've lived through how many hurricanes? Like 2017, I was a junior in high school and we lived through Hurricane Harvey. Like we can do this. We can plant roots here. We can rebuild over and over again, and we get stronger. And so in terms of taste, I want to locate us in okra. Have a tattoo of okra on my back, because of course I do. And it was at my aunt's house in Louisiana where I tried pickled okra for the first time. And I was like, you know, I've seen all the ways that South Asians can make okra, bhindi, bhinda, bendekai, the whole lot, you know, all the names that we have for okra in all of our languages. I don't know that I need to be experiencing pickled okra. It looked a little creepy, the baby okras in like a big glass bottle in the fridge, but I was like, okay. And I ate it and I said, wait a minute, why haven't we been doing this? And so I realized, we come from the same place, right? So okra was brought to the southern United States by enslaved African people as a means of survival for food, but also for reproductive justice. Because with the sliminess of okra, it's an abortifacient. You can have an abortion and you can protect your bodily autonomy. And I said, okay, they enslaved African people, Southern Black people, grew okra here in the South to protect themselves, protect their bodies, and further the lives of their children by, providing nutritious food. I said, weren't we doing the same thing in South Asia, right? Weren't we also growing this particular crop? Weren't we also, finding a way out of no way? Weren't we also, trying to protect our bodily autonomy in times where women didn't have those types of rights? And so it just reminds me, right? Like all the things that a simple plant can do. It can be so many different cuisines. It can connect us across cultures, and it can remind us of our duty to fight for liberation, even when it doesn't seem possible. Even when there doesn't seem to be a way forward, there's always a way in the small things that we can put into the ground and wait for them to grow. So, long story, but here we are in Louisiana, and I'm going to read the Louisiana section of my essay. All right. So, for context, nartangai is a South Indian word for citron. Nartangai, Monroe, Louisiana. The day of our second storm in 6 weeks, it's already raining, the sky low and gray as school buildings or uncleaned mantles. Ash, dust, even the yellow of the nartangai hanging into our soggy garden is not bright, but a fake sweetness, dull as imitation sugar. We squeeze bottled condensed milk into afternoon tea. This is a hurricane. I am sure somewhere my sister is measuring sugar with her clothes dusted in fine powder. I cannot see her. My hair collects rain, glimmering like imitation. I'm a black box in my stiff jacket, moving hot air between various pockets, picking nartangai up from the ground. Sitting them carelessly in various buckets, I am tempted to sink my teeth into one, to spoil the unmarred yellow skin as proof that the wind is still slow, and there is feeling beyond the thrash of crepe myrtle branches against a beloved window. Windows become loved when they are beat once every 6 weeks in the sweating heat of summer. More people sweat a week beat in a loving summer, by which I mean more heart attacks happen on daylight savings day than any other. I do not know if this is a fact, but my aunt mentions it as we're driving after to get bread and real milk. We learn from our mistakes. Mine have cooled our hands to better scoop ice without melting it. Mine carry 2 bags of ice to our car and stuff them into the cool bags my sister and I once made fun of. We used to load groceries we bought from a parrot in a tropical heat. I watch myself like an anchored cloud. The clouds drift by quickly. They are pushed along at 60 miles an hour. I drive that fast and my hands shake. The winds tremble at their own audacity, at the wide mouth of the bayou and all the dead things rising, clutching their howling sneakers. At some point, I hear nothing but Paul Wall saying, drive slow. At some point, the traffic pole is nothing but twisted metal saying, drive slow. At some point, the nartangai have been raked off the bare tree and toweled off into Walmart bags. We drive through slow puddles to leave them at low doorsteps. Rain collects like the beginning of a flood in the slick gray plastic. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Anar.
Well, seconds for Mike choreo.
There we go.
Thank you. Sorry. That was really beautiful. So we have one last piece, and we'll come back to Khem. Khem's piece is Lakshmi Sir in America, about a Nepali immigrant who is lucky enough to get the DV, which I had to look up, I think is a specific term, maybe for
countries
to
like
certain
Nepal
countries.
and
Yes,
others, yeah.
exactly. And that's the diversity visa. And Lakshmi Sir just simply cannot let go of his former life. And Khem, all of us, I think, know a Lakshmi Sir, someone who refuses to let go of their past. And I especially appreciated how you captured that obsession in Lakshman Sir in America, where at every chance he gets, Lakshman Sir reminds everyone around him and himself of his former title. He was a teacher and was called Lakshman Sir. Can you talk about that character's trajectory in this story?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. But before that, can I briefly talk about the pieces that we've heard about?
Can I get a
That-
time check
yep.
from ER? I think it's
So how much time do we have actually, right?
Yeah, so we're at 8:15, and I think we're gonna
Everybody, right? Okay.
we started at 11.
I'll try to be very brief, okay? So all these pieces, of course, I loved all of them. I love all the pieces here. And here, one dominant theme for us was politics, basically, right? Yours is political, and of course, everything is political, even yours. We can, right? We cannot escape that. So at the same time, as I was working on this anthology, one thing I wanted to be very clear about was, okay, we are all activists, because you cannot afford not to be when you are away from your home. Like Nafisa, for instance, that's a wonderful example. She's not that type, but all the circumstances, what can she do, right? That's what she's made now. So at the same time, I wanted to, again, editing an anthology is kind of weird stuff. It's very subjective, and it has a lot to do with your interest as well. And one of my focuses was, okay, we are doing politics, identity, this and that, but at the same time, I want this piece to be a really good literary representation. That's another aspect. I wanted to highlight that aspect of this anthology. So in all these cases, of course, see, we highlighted one aspect, this particular trait of this character or that, right? That's always important. But at the same time, for instance, in Aruni's case, yeah, she's a, like you said, weird character, but at the same time, yeah, the way you are, shown your care for her, right? You are making fun of her, but at the same time, you've shown compassion, right? That's so nicely captured. And of course, that's tragic comic aspect. V.S. Naipaul, all of us have read that guy, right? Some certain things apart. So that was giving me that vibe. And when it came to Anjali's essay, that's so wonderful. I mean, the idea that one particular thing that tossed me so much, that is, you talk about your upbringing and everything, that idea that, okay, how do you experience a race in America? Who experiences a race in America? How? Then I also came to America very late in my life. I think I can say that, when I was in my 30s. And see, back home, we had no idea of a race. We had caste, of course, that's a different thing. Then how do you experience race here? So then in your essay, this idea that, okay, there are new arrivals, and they have no clue, right? But you lived here, you were born here, you lived here. Now your way of looking at race or understanding race, experiencing race is so different. And the way you've captured that so beautifully, you've done fabulous job. All other things, of course, very important, but that idea. Then coming to Rukmini's essay, the one thing I was looking at, it also kind of comes to my essay and all those things. That is, different people who migrated to America or other places at different times. Now, see, things are changing, right? That is, see, migration is of course, it's nothing new. That has happened. That's human civilization, right? We've been moving all the time. There's nothing new about that. I think it's about, how do we see those migrations? How do we experience those migrations, and how do we capture them, right? Then in the present world, globalization, social media, to all these different things, in this context, how do we experience these things? And in the essay, the way you conflict all these, like, okay, for you, Bangalore or Louisiana, this or that, all those places become one for you, right? So it's, I think in that essay, I can see that it's not, okay, I'm an American girl, Indian girl, South Asian. That's not the point, right? You are a composite whole of all these experiences. So of course, your language, to all those things, so beautifully captured, and you already read out that section. That's wonderful. Anyway, coming to my piece, Lakshman Sir in America, this whole idea of obsession again. He's always obsessed with that idea. And that's one thing that happens with at least most of us, or especially those who move to other places later in their life, not as a child, right? Because I think one thing I find really interesting is we are not just living the present, right? We are always living the past and even our future, right? In our dreams. So we as individuals are always trying to bring all those things together. So for those people like Lakshmi sir, so that part is left behind and he's in a way kind of forced to forget because of the circumstances. And he cannot, of course, right? And in this case, what happens is he was a teacher, this idea of sir, and that's what happens in most of my stories. Actually, I'm advertising, my short story is coming, collection is coming out this October. So I just look at this one small trigger. In this case, his boss happens to call him sir. Nobody had called him sir in America. So back home, teacher is a sir, right? That's how even here we see in our circle we say that. So that idea that just the term triggers him, sir, and he just cannot get rid of that idea. I'm actually a sir. What are you doing here at this Amazon store, right? Or what am I doing here? See, doing this or that stuff. I'm a sir, right? So basically, he was not even kind of not allowed, but wearing dressing up as a teacher, right, with pleated shirt and everything, black shoes. That would not help working as a picker at the Amazon store. So he had to give up all those things. Then he keeps thinking about those dresses and all. Oh, I used to wear them, but I cannot do that anymore. So one obsession leads to another, right? And another, and just cannot get rid of that. Then the idea I think I'm trying to kind of capture is that again, this, who is he as an individual? It's not just the present, the comfort, the money that America is giving him, right? So he's that also. So without bringing in that identity into play, then he's incomplete. That's what he's experiencing all his life. And that happens, I guess, with all the characters we create, right? In this form or that form.
I did have a closing question, but I would like to make some time for Q&A. I think we have a full room, so I imagine there are plenty of questions. And then I might just transform my closing question into a closing thought. So we can.
Yeah. I'll bring the mic around, but to give folks a second who are physically in this room to think about your question, I will read our virtual question. So the question is, how do you think y'all as Southern South Asian writers can help all of us understand what's happening politically in the US and South Asia right now, similarities and differences? And I'll just say not everybody needs to answer every question, but if someone feels strongly, feel free to move forward and I'll unmute you. Anjali?
I'd love to answer this question. So one of the beautiful and wonderful things about being in the South is that we have a long and wonderful history of civil rights here that has been led by Black people in the US. In fact, most of us would not actually be in the US if it wasn't for Black activists. You know, I mentioned the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. That may have been signed by President Johnson, but it was there because of Black activists. It was, you know, and before 1965, of course, there were South Asians here in the US who arrived sometime in the 1700s, more towards the end of the 1800s as farmers and laborers. But it was really 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act that opened the floodgates. So here's the problem, though, is that a lot of South Asians do not understand that they exist here in the United States because of the civil rights movement and because of the work of Black people. And because of that, we sort of see many of us sort of fall prey to a different kind of politics where aligning ourselves with whiteness and white people, we feel get us ahead and give us what we need. And this is misinformation. It is not factual. It is not based in history. And so I think part of political involvement of the South Asian community needs to be rooted in an understanding of the communities that helped bring us here and have helped raise us here. And that lack of history is something that I know many people on the panel talk about in their communities, but there is a belief somehow that we live a life more fully if we become more, quote, assimilated, which has always meant assimilation into white supremacy. So I think activism in our community should start with understanding that white supremacy does not serve us now, and it has never serviced us, or you know, any kind of discrimination against any marginalized group, and that if we want to heal and help all communities in this country, we need to educate ourselves and become a part of the movement that is led by Black folks, Indigenous folks, and other marginalized communities. It's the only way. It is the only way forward for South Asians in the United States. And you know, and I think that's where the activism has to start in our community.
I don't know if this is working. Thank you. Thank you, Anjali. I don't think I could have said this any better than Anjali, because you have worked so much in the grassroots, and since 2018, ever since I moved here, I have seen Anjali work and what she has done through her writing and through her work. And we have met very few times, but I've always admired. So thank you for saying all of that. But at the same time, I remember I came here from India for my job interview at University of Georgia. I was working at a university in India there, and it was 2017 February. And my entire conversation, every colleague who are friends now, every professor, it was about Modi and Trump. And we just were so upset at what was happening. And I remember, actually, and my job talk was called Sex, Sedition, and Storytelling, writing under an authoritarian regime. And I remember getting a very rousing response. But what I repeatedly concluded with all my prospective colleagues in 2017 was that how fragile democracy is and how much hard work it requires to keep it alive and sustainable. So that we must never forget. And yes, a new election has happened a few years ago. 45th is gone, but the poison that was spread then is still here. And it is like, you know, a nuclear reaction. It's going to be here for a while, and we really have to be vigilant and really have to continue working. That's one thing. And the final thing I want to say is that I'm very deeply uncomfortable with the current administration cozying up to Modi. And it has really bothered me, given me a lot of sleepless nights, and we must talk about it, we must write about it, and we must continually resist. I know this won't go down a very long way immediately, but it will eventually, hopefully, make a difference. But and I think that we have to be very vigilant about who we are actually becoming friends with. Just because China is dangerous doesn't mean that we cozy up to India and keep quiet about the massive human rights violations happening now. I'm going to end with one last statement. Ishanika was my student at Ashoka University. I remember between 2014 and I'm sorry, you're wearing a mask. Yeah, anyway, between 2014 and 2016, I remember how many protest marches many of my students had to go, actually, and we went. And the situation has worsened in India at this point. It is so difficult to even actually teach controversial subjects. And we have to take lessons because, India is the largest democracy and so on. But look at what is happening. Every democratic institution has been decimated to the point that even the chief justices have come forward and said, what's going on? And have given press conferences. And considering the really intimate and very complicated relationship actually South Asian countries, especially India, has with United States, we really cannot ignore all of that. And what I'm saying is actually nothing new. We have been screaming horrors for a long time now, but I just wanted to reiterate it and keep these things in mind.
Thank you. Thank you both. I wanted to give folks in this room an opportunity to ask a question or two, if anyone has anything yet.
My name is Saurabh, and I actually have a comment, not a question, for writer Enjeti. I'm a language teacher who often teach second and third generation immigrant writers English composition. When I read your story, there was a tiny part where you mentioned that you are South Asian but don't speak Hindi or any other Indian language. And perhaps you're most comfortable in that language. As a teacher, it was a good reminder for me to sort of not assume that every immigrant student that I might teach or generation will be multilingual. So it was a good pedagogical lesson for me, even though it was a tiny part in your story, but it just stayed with me. So I just wanted to let you know that.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I only speak English, and I'm only 50% Indian. So my father is an Indian immigrant, but my mother is not Indian. So I think, South Asians are very, very, very diverse, right? Some of us were born in the U.S., some of us immigrated, some of us are not 100% biologically or genetically South Asian. And are in mixed race, ethnic, language, faith partnerships with other people. I think that's part of the beauty of our diversity. There are things that, like the language issue, though, and I think it's in South Asia, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of languages, right? But I think the diversity in our communities is so beautiful, and it's who we are. And I think of the diaspora so much like the subcontinent, right? I mean, there's so much diversity there, and it travels to all the countries that we or our ancestors immigrate to, and makes us who we are. Thank you for that beautiful comment.
Hi, I'm Tina. I just, from what you were talking about, South Asians being a diverse group, I just want to ask you, where does in identity politics, how do you balance out the identity and the politics in it? Like we see Rishi Sunak, being a prime minister in a place where they wanted Brexit, right? But he's not aligned with the South Asian or the immigrant experience over there, and his wife has been saying that we need to stop immigration. So how do you I mean, I forgot what I was asking, but yeah, how do you go about balance?
Great question. Yeah,
Yeah, sure. I'll give a brief response. I think, that question reminds me of what Anar said right at the very beginning. Representation is not it. Just because, yes, there's a South Asian person as a prime minister in a country that colonized us, congratulations. I mean, you're continuing on the work of the colonizers. You're not actually doing anything liberatory for our people. And so I think it comes back to what Anjali was saying, actually, about being principled. I'm sorry, I'm going to take the mask off for a second. My ears are apparently too small to hold it to my face so I can talk. I know. Okay, yeah. So it's about how do we find a politic that makes sense for our community? How do we communicate that in a way where people don't run away? And how do we stand in responsibility too for the people of our community that have done harm to members of our own community? And I think about this a lot as somebody with a lot of privilege within the South Asian diaspora. I'm Indian, I'm Hindi speaking, I'm Hindu, I'm upper caste. Like, I have a lot of privileges that have caused the immigration story that my family has had. And as such, here it's easy for me, especially, my last name doesn't betray anything about my caste. It's easy for me to just like slip into this broader idea of South Asian and not really interrogate, what is my responsibility not to undo, but to take responsibility for and be accountable for the harms of my ancestors, to be accountable for and take responsibility for the harms of my own community, my own, privileged members of my community that are doing harm to other folks, to other South Asian folks, and to other marginalized, racialized folks. And so I think that it comes down to, yeah, we can write about it all we want, but we have to get up off the page. We have to be in those political spaces. We have to find community. We have to act at the end of the day. And if we're acting, we're doing the right thing. We're moving for liberation. And I think that that's way better than any kind of representation that we might achieve.
That is such a great question, Rukmini. That was a beautiful response. I will just add that a little anecdotal story. In 2017 is when I became an electoral organizer in the South Asian community. And one of the toughest things for me to sort of, there was this myth. Every time I was talking with Indians, they would say, well, all Indians are Republicans. And it's a perfect example of, and Indians in the US have incidentally historically voted for Democrats across the board, whatever state you're in, et cetera. But the reason I bring this up is because what happens is those in our community who are extremists, who are right wingers, who want to reduce the amount of rights for just about everyone, tend to be the loudest and have the best PR. And this is a real problem in our community. And it just means we all need to be so loud and make sure it's clear that those people do not represent us. Because the truth of the matter is when you look at South Asians across the board, the views on a lot of issues are very similar and they're not right wing. But the problem is you have these people coming up who are, who are essentially fascists, and they're loud, and so we have people in our community sort of, unsure. Well, do I really feel this way about the issues? And then we have people outside of our community thinking that we agree with those extremist views. So it just means that the rest of us have to get louder, because let's be real, the vast majority of South Asians want abortion rights. They want immigration rights. They want health care. They want comprehensive health care for everybody. Affirmative action. Like, we're really not a lot of the people who tend to have the most money and represent us the loudest on a public platform. And we just need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to undermine those views.
We have some lovely comments in the chat of appreciation that I just wanted to lift up quickly before we close out. So just lots of people saying thank you for this beautiful conversation. And also one person saying thank you for the honesty of this conversation. And as a recent immigrant to the South, this is a hope-giving conversation. So thank you. Yes, totally. So I want to pass the mic back to Anar to close us out.
Sorry, just won't touch that. Thank you so much. And I would agree that this has been a hope-giving conversation. The last question that I had was prompted by a paragraph in Khem's introduction about the conditions of the South Asian experience in the South and how that, and in the US, and how that sort of informs South Asian writing. And I'll read a few lines from it and then just sort of bring it back to some of the things that we've been talking about. It says, it's in the middle of the paragraph, but it is equally pertinent to remember that South Asian immigrants' experience because of their late arrival tend to be different from those of many other Asian immigrants because of their late arrival in the United States. As Bucky Retimani, a scholar of South Asian American studies, explains, South Asians didn't participate in large numbers in the civil rights and ethnic studies movements in the 1960s and 70s because many immigrated to the US only after 1965, the year of the abolition of the National Origins Act. Similarly, South Asia didn't have a direct historical connection with the US, which they had with European empires. This is bound to define their experience of the South uniquely, and it is reflected in the works here. And, I think that is a part of the narrative of the South Asian experience in the United States and of the South Asian American experience, but I don't think that it has to be. I think as, Anjali opened in the questions about what is the connection between the abolition of the National Origins Act and the civil rights movement, and our experience in the United States as South Asian Americans cannot be extricated from that of Black Americans or from settler colonialism and from the fact that land was stolen from Indigenous people. To say that, because of a chronological timeline that we don't have a connection is absolution that is not warranted. And similarly, of those of us who are from caste privileged Hindu backgrounds in the United States, to absolve ourselves of what is ongoing in India. And, even if we are, if South Asians are Democrats in the United States, but then a part of the majoritarian ruling class, wherever they are from South Asia, that is not justification for absolution of our complicity. And that was my question originally to the panel, was about what is our responsibility to sort of reinforce that we cannot be absolved, even as we experience racism, marginalization in a variety of ways ourselves. And, I think all of the writers answered that in the Q&A and as they were speaking themselves. So it's not so much a question, I guess, as a reminder to all of us, including myself. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much. I want to let folks who are watching virtually know that they can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy South to South, Writing South Asia in the American South from Charis. We would love for you to do that. You are also invited to support the work of Charis Circle, our nonprofit. If you are physically here in the room with us, you can get your first dib of books. So feel free to go get one from the front counter and get it signed by the folks who are here. And as always, thank you so much to everyone for being with us tonight. We really appreciate it.